Hello, and welcome to the Nutrition and Life podcast. This is where we look at various nutrition and fitness-related topics through the lens of application. We want to give you practical takeaways so that you can create your healthiest, best self backed by knowledge. Now, on to the episode with your host, Coach Lisa.
Hello and welcome back to the Nutrition and Life podcast. My name is Lisa, I'm your host, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with nutrition coach, fitness model, and host of the Chasing Clarity podcast, Brandon de Cruz. Welcome to the show, Brandon.
Lisa, thank you for having me on. It's my pleasure.
I'm really excited to talk to you today about coaching philosophies, your own nutrition strategies, and everything else. But before we get into that, I would love for you to just give us a little bit of an intro into who you are and how you got into coaching.
Absolutely. So like you said, I'm a nutrition and physique coach. I'm an educator. I'm an internationally published fitness model. And I've spent many years, competing as a national level physique competitor. And now I've more so transitioned into coaching. So these days, my role is as a nutrition, physique, and health coach. And I work with clients of all different backgrounds. So I'm ranging from like high level, executives to even guys at the top tier of like the IFBB. So I work with, fitness pros as well, competitive athletes. And I've been doing online coaching for over 10 years at this point. So I was kind of into it before many have been. So I've went through trials and tribulations and really gotten a lot of experience. But besides being a coach for the past 10 years, I've also, I just left this industry recently, but I spent 14 years working within the sports nutrition industry. So I actually worked for evidence-based supplement brands throughout the US, such as NutriBio Labs. And I did a lot within that industry for a long period of time. So really, like, my entire career has been fitness focused, to say the least. And at this point in my life, I do a lot with I coach, and I mentor a lot of other fitness coaches and other very fitness-minded, individuals, whether that be competitors, that be other coaches, that be mentees, things of that sort. And I think what really, has set me apart within this industry in terms of what I do is that I've never had like a niche market. So if you ever ask me, like, what's my target demographic? What's my client avatar? It's never been one. So I've really, I've always taken on people from different walks of life and different backgrounds, which has allowed me to gain a lot of experience. And it's allowed me to attain knowledge to work with and help clients of all different backgrounds. So regardless of their goal, if it's losing fat, building muscle, improving their health and quality of life, or improving performance, I've worked with those individuals and helped them get to their goals. So besides like working with clients and mentees, I do a lot towards, continuing education. And so that's why I jump on a bunch of podcasts. I know that you interviewed one of my clients myself, who's Jeremiah Bear, good friend of mine. And so, this past year, actually, I'd been on hundreds of podcasts over the years, and I started my own podcast, as you mentioned, the Chasing Clarity podcast. So I really try to put out a lot of evidence-based information. And really my goal is to bridge the gap between research and information and then practical application, because I'm not a researcher. I do have an education in this. However, really my emphasis or my focus is on bridging that gap and really applying it in the trenches, having worked with over 1,000 clients over the past 10 years. So we often have like this dichotomous relationship between like researchers in the ivory tower, and then we have like coaches in the practice field. And so I'm really trying to bridge the gap. And I've been very fortunate that a lot of my close friends and mentors have been in the research field and then have allowed me or have given me these skills to really break down research and understand that stuff and then apply it to my own clients. So, in terms of how I got into coaching, I kind of got into this industry in a little bit of different way than most people. At this point, I've been training 17 years, but I initially got into fitness because I had, I was a competitive athlete growing up, and I went through a lot of experiences that, essentially I was in weight controlled, competitive sports. I did martial arts and I did endurance training or endurance running. And so they were very weight restricted. So I ended up suffering from what's now known as relative energy deficiency in sport. At that time, it way predates that. So we're talking the early 2000s. The International Olympic Committee did not put out a consensus statement on relative energy deficiency in sport until 2014, right before the Olympics. So I way predated that. But essentially, how I got into nutrition and fitness was I was an overtrained athlete, essentially. I was doing way too much, underfueling myself, didn't really understand how to pair nutrition and training. And I was training 3 to 4 hours a day, but then underfueling myself. And so I was lucky in the fact that I ended up getting, I guess recommended to a physical therapy clinic. And it was run by a bodybuilder. That, they were both physical therapists, but one was a bodybuilder and a nutritionist, and one was a powerlifter. So they really taught me about the importance of nutrition and about fueling yourself. And it really like sparked this curiosity and this interest in me to get into nutrition, get into training, get into supplementation. So, that really started me off early on in high school, really getting into this industry, really learning about things and really going in the direction of continuing my education in that aspect. But I grew up with a father who was a type 2 diabetic. So I saw, we're going to talk about like how resistance training impacts insulin sensitivity throughout this course of this podcast. And I'm really passionate about that because, I saw my father had a heart attack in front of me, when I was a kid, and it was really impactful to me. And it was, he suffered all these metabolic syndrome criteria, were these disease complications as a result of what started out as insulin resistance, which progressed to type 2 diabetes, and it had a lot of health ramifications. So really that made me more interested in nutrition training and lifestyle and how that impacts, body composition and health outcomes. And when it comes down to it, I feel like a lot of us coaches, if you really go back to like your backstory, many of us gravitate towards covering topics and issues that we've dealt with personally, or we've seen our family deal with. And it creates these close ties and bonds and interests that kind of push us past what most people would do in their own profession. If we look at, I have friends that are lawyers, I have friends that are, in different fields. And yes, they do it because they like the job itself, but they're not spending all their time learning about it outside of their actual work hours. But what we do, we're constantly diving into things. I'm constantly studying. And so really, my entire life experiences, what I've went through, what I've seen my own family go through, has really kind of centered my focus around what I consider health-centric coaching, where I aim to, like I mentioned, bridge the gap between research and information, and then practical application. But I'm trying to also strike a balance between what's optimal for a client's goals and then what's practical within the constraints of their lifestyle. So it's really, in a nutshell, like what I'm looking to do and what I've really, my main focus has been this past 10 years.
I love that. Thank you for giving us a bit of a background and so many great points. Actually, that little tagline that you just said, bridging the gap between information and application, is really what also drew me to your account and just to your content, because I love that. And even for someone like me, I mean, I studied exercise science and nutrition. I have a master's in am somewhat able to read research, but even for me, the language, the methodics, everything else behind it, like it's made in a way that it's a little bit confusing. And I started a research and connection group just recently for that purpose, with other like-minded individuals, to talk about the latest research once a week. But nonetheless, the research changes slowly and adapts very slowly. And there, it's so nice to have that other part that you mentioned, which is quote unquote anecdata. So, from experience things. And so I love that you bring those two together as well, because just because there is not a study for something doesn't mean it's not true. And also, just because something isn't proven, but someone believes it's true for them, doesn't mean that it's not true for them. We know how placebo works and how powerful it really, really can be. So yeah, I love that you're combining those two, that you're combining all of your past experience and what you have learned from various mentors or coaches as well. And you mentioned two things. You mentioned or two people. It was someone who was a bodybuilder and someone who was a power lifter that you kind of initially started working with. And I mean, of course, there are a lot of overlaps between the two, but there are also a lot of differences. So I'm really interested to hear how that has manifested in your training, your clients' training. And one post that I saw on your content as well, or on your Instagram, was specifically going into detail with the importance of rest, of taking deloads, and that often that is the part that we neglect the most. Everyone is interested in what's the best rep range, what is the best blah blah blah, but then we don't talk so much about how should I really manage my deloads. I would love for you to talk a little bit about the philosophy behind that, even just from within a training session, rest times here for what specific purposes, but also in a week, in a month, in a year. How should we approach it all?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of, I'll break it down by the order that you kind of went in. I think I was very fortunate with my personal experience, because I got into training very early on, and the one bodybuilder was more bodybuilding and nutrition based, but the power lifter at that time, this is the early 2000s. So what was very popular at that time was something called power bodybuilding. You know what I mean? Power building, essentially. And this was like the early days of like Layne Norton and guys like that. So he was a power lifter that did a lot of strength emphasis, the other owner of this PT clinic. However, he did have like a physique focus. So he would do like his strength work and then do his accessory work more in like bodybuilding rep ranges and more accessory work towards hypertrophy. So I got a really good blend of both between the two of them, of the importance of strength training, not only for building your body, because at the time I'd essentially broken my body down. I was underfueling myself. I was over exercising, a lot of endurance training. It was the exact opposite of what I kind of transferred over to these last 20 years. And so really within that, they taught me about the importance of multiple things. So the importance of pairing our training with our nutrition, but also the rest component, because at that time I was doing multiple sports. I was, running both cross country and track. I was doing multiple practices per day. I was running in the morning and in the evenings, then going to martial arts after. And so I was training 2 to 3 times per day. So rest was not in my agenda 20 years ago. And this is something I've really learned about. But really, when it comes down to the topic of rest, rest and recovery are two essential components of the training process, but it's something that's really overlooked. And I think it's important to hit on why we even need to focus on rest and recovery. And that's due to the fact that we have to realize that training is a form of stress that challenges our body both physically and mentally. And, it's funny because a lot of us look at training and we love training. So we don't see training as a stressor, but the process of lifting weights literally presents our muscle fibers. Like if we think about it from a mechanistic perspective, it's presenting our bodies and our muscle fibers with mechanical stress and metabolic stress. And so these are stressors in and of themselves. And just like any other type of stress we face, it challenges our current state and pushes our bodies to adapt to handle that training. However, just like any other form of stress, our bodies can either adapt in a positive way or negative way. So we could have positive adaptations or we could have maladaptations. And it really comes down to how you recover. And so this is why rest and recovery are so crucial, as we really can only train as hard as we recover. And we can only positively adapt to our training and respond to it. And actually, if we think about what are the purposes behind our training, for many clients that come to me, it's with body composition goals in mind. So they want to build muscle, they want to increase strength. And we can only respond to that training stimulus if our recovery is dialed in. So we have to look at what training induces. Training, a lot of times we only think about like training from like the positive adaptation perspective. So we know training increases muscle mass, it increases muscular endurance, it increases strength. But what else does that come with? Because if we look at the fitness fatigue model, it comes with 2 different adaptations. So with training, it induces both fitness and fatigue. And so training itself induces both acute and, chronic, or what we would really refer to in this industry as like accumulated fatigue. And so with acute fatigue, that's what happens within the session itself. So that's a decrease in performance during a workout or immediately after. So this is why, like, if you think about it, if you take your first set of an exercise to complete failure, you're not going to we're going to see generally a drop off in repetitions after there. So the subsequent sets, you're going to see a drop off in work capacity and performance. And, it's because of that acute fatigue that we've accumulated right within that short, period of time. And that acute fatigue also follows us after the session, which is why, if anyone has tried this, which I don't recommend, but if you were to do a training session and you went, fairly hard within the session itself, it's not like you can come back to the gym that same day or a few hours later and repeat that same training performance and hit those same performances. So we have acute fatigue that we have to manage through rest and recovery. But then we also have chronic fatigue or accumulated fatigue. And this is a fatigue that accumulates throughout the course of our training during our training weeks. And then also in addition to the outside factors. And that's what adds to like our allostatic load, or, I like to kind of like relate this to my clients is this is our total stress bucket. And we don't have all these different buckets. It's not like we have a training bucket, a nutrition interventions bucket, an emotional bucket, a relationship bucket, like everything gets piled up into one. So it's easy to overflow. So we have to realize that our training, our nutrition, our mental and emotional stress, our work-related stress, and any other stressors, even like sleep quality or lack thereof, they all, accumulate into this bucket. So as we're training, our fitness is increasing. We're seeing improvements in work capacity. We're seeing improvements in strength performance, but also we're seeing fatigue increase. And that's going to often, what we see is fatigue will often match fitness, which is why, it's so important to dissipate fatigue and, really dial in that rest and recovery to be able to get our performances back up and really be able to express those fitness characteristics and those improvements that we've made. So if we look at, rest from a high level perspective and we go into different forms of rest, we can look at within session rest, which would be like you alluded to, rest intervals. Then we can look at rest days within the training week. Then we can look at deloads. So rest periods within the mesocycle. So when it comes down to like rest intervals, that'll be like our first like bottom level rung. Like what type of rest are we taking in between our actual training session? So when it comes to rest periods or rest intervals, I find that many people don't rest long enough in between sets. As many, like if we see, like look at a lot of people in the gym, they're like rushing from machine, set to set. And I find, even when I have new clients come on board and I do a consultation with them and I'm speaking with them about this, I ask them why. I'm very inquisitive, and I like to ask people why, because I want to know the intention behind why they do things. And often they want to feel fatigued. They want to feel that feeling of exhaustion because they relate that to a good workout, or they relate that to inducing hypertrophy. But we have to realize we have to separate the two. And if we actually look at the research behind rest intervals and hypertrophy, we see that the longer rest intervals are more effective for muscle growth. So for instance, if we look at some of the best like data that we have on this, Brad Schoenfeld has done research on this topic, and he's actually, comparatively done randomized controls trials where he's looked at 1 minute rest intervals, within one group versus 3-minute rest intervals with another. And they found that the group using 3-minute rest intervals between sets gained both more muscle and more strength within 8-week training intervention study. So we see that a longer rest is going to help you maintain better training performance set to set. It's going to help you have better work capacity and essentially more volume load. So that's sets times reps times load throughout the course of a training cycle. Because think about it like this: if you are to only use 1 minute rest intervals, which many people do, you may be able to go to failure on your first set and you may get 12 reps, but we're going to see that your ability to do reps drop off significantly, especially if you're more limited by your within session fatigue. Whereas if you were to take a few more minutes, I'm not saying you're going to get 12 again because that was your failure set, but you might only lose a rep or two per set. Whereas a lot of times you'll see people go from like 12 to 7 to 5, and they're really, skewing that rep range due to a decrease in work capacity. And here's the thing: when we look at it, like I work with people in the real world, so I understand that we have research studies that say this and that can't always apply to people. So not every client or person is going to want to wait 3 minutes or more between every set. So this is where using a combination of rest periods is useful. And how I kind of approach this is it's based on the exercise itself. So when I do programming, I'm always talking to someone about their preferences, because you kind of alluded to this. It's great to have research, but we also have to have research. We have to have me-search, and we have to realize that evidence-based practice, which is what a lot of us pride ourselves in, it's a triangle essentially. So it is the experiences of the practitioner, the best of the body of literature, and then it's also the client preferences, abilities, and their goals. So we have to combine that. That is what truly evidence-based coaching is. So it's not just what PubMed says, it's not just what research says, it's not just what your experiences as a coach or clinician are, and it's not just what the client is, it's melding and molding all those things into one. So how I look at this, and usually how I program for my own self and then for my clients, is I'll use longer rest intervals when we're doing compound, exercises that are going to hit multiple muscle groups. And this is because generally they're going to benefit from longer rest periods as they're more demanding. You're generally using higher loads. A lot of them focus on the lengthened portion of the movement. So they're inducing more damage, more muscle damage. And so they're more taxing. So resting longer will allow us to keep our performance and our work capacity up longer. But then when it comes down to isolation movements, especially when they're for smaller muscle groups, that's where I'm going to use shorter rest intervals, as the likelihood of seeing a drastic rep drop off between sets is going to be a lot less with these movements, because they're only isolating one body part. They're not as systemically taxing. They're not accumulating as much fatigue. So what I generally do is I suggest to combine the two strategies of using both longer rest on compounds and then shorter rest on isolation movements like keyboard machine work, especially if you're in a time crunch, because we have to realize the best plan on paper for hypertrophy is useless if someone can't actually execute upon it. So we have to always take into consideration, like I work with high-level IFBB pros, but I also work with high-level execs that have families, that have businesses that they run, and they're, it's 30 to 45 minutes that they have 3 to 4 days a week. So we have to make time-effective training. So you really have to take into consideration the time constraints of the client, the abilities of the client, their recovery capacity, their training experience. You have to take into consideration their preferences. Some people like being in the gym 90 minutes and some don't. So these are where rest intervals are extremely important to really be able to take what we see in the research and apply it in certain contexts to maximize outcomes, but then also be able to utilize different strategies to optimize what that person has at their disposal. So another, it's a little bit of a side from rest intervals, but a lot of things that I like to use are antagonist paired sets. So that would be like the utilization of, say, a chest and back superset. So within that, we actually see that you can get as much or even greater total work done in terms of total volume and the maintenance of that volume by utilizing like a chest and back superset. So generally in the research, you'll see them do like a bench press to a row, but that could be any combination of a push and pull exercise where you could take 1 minute in between there and you can cut down on your rest intervals in totality throughout the session, but get just as many reps per set because there's this co-activation between antagonist muscle groups where it's almost like utilizing, say, like your chest during a bench press or during a pressing movement is priming your back. So it's this synergism that you can get from utilizing. So knowing some of these strategies between rest intervals, between antagonist paired sets, between different, strategies, whether it be rest pause or any of these things, we can maximize outcomes, but still get the sufficient rest per body part.
I love that. And I'm actually totally on the same page when it comes to my programming as well, and the longer rest sets for compounds and shorter for isolation work or accessory work. And I'm a huge fan of supersetting, exactly like you mentioned, or even trisets when it comes to antagonist movement, or just in general to optimize rest times. And I can totally relate to people as well when they're like, well, I don't want to rest for 3 minutes if I'm only working out for 40 minutes or something like that. That feels like a waste of time to me. And I often find it difficult when it comes to phone use and recommendations during training for that purpose, because on the one hand, it pulls our focus away from what we're doing and what we want to be focusing on. But at the same time, and this might be an unpopular statement, but at the same time, having your phone with you in the gym can help you stick with that rest time, as opposed to being too bored after 20 seconds, like, oh, I'm just going to start again.
No, absolutely. What's really interesting about that is because as I've transitioned, so initially when I got into this industry, 10 years ago within coaching, I had 2 jobs during the entirety of this. So a lot of times when I was training, I had to answer emails because I was either on the clock for my day job, or just to the fact that I needed to allocate as much time towards my work as possible. And it was back then, and we're going to talk about this later, this is actually one of the things that I've changed my mind on, because 10 years ago, we were chasing the pump. We were chasing fatigue. We were chasing that lactate buildup and that accumulation of hydrogen ions and that feeling of like your skin bursting, thinking that was inducing hypertrophy. And that's because at that time, there was many different mechanisms that were proposed to induce hypertrophy. We had the 3 main mechanisms, which were mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. Well, now we know that it's really mechanical tension. So the tension that we put on the fibers themselves, and the other 2 are kind of like backdoors that, to hypertrophy that come along with mechanical tension or just byproducts. So a lot of the things that I did back then, I was utilizing shorter rest intervals, and I found that not only did my performances improve, my recovery between sessions, within sessions improved when I utilized longer rest breaks, but then I got to do a 2-for-1. So I would use my phone to do different things that I needed to do. And as long as I was able to get back into the mindset, so generally what I would do is I would only utilize, so we see this within the performance literature, even within sports, is music can upregulate performance. And so I have certain top set songs, that I only tap into that. And it's the same kind of thing. We have to realize that with all stimuli, we get habituated. So whether it's training, it's caffeine use. I think the best, analogy would be caffeine use. Same thing with music. So just like with caffeine, if we're constantly utilizing it, you still get benefits out of it, but you're not feeling that same increase in energy and increase in alertness that you would generally feel when you've been off it for a while, or you've titrated your dose. So you use lower amounts, say in the beginning of your mesocycle, and then maybe at your last week of that mesocycle where you're really pushing, maybe in an overreaching phase, that then you utilize a larger dose, which more in line with, say, that 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram, which we really see to be like the most beneficial from a performance outcomes. And the same thing with music. So generally what I'll do is, I'll turn off my music and maybe I'll do an email or 2, but then when I need to get back into my top sets or my actual working sets, the music's coming back on, I'm getting back locked in, and I've leveraged that fact that I've had a few minutes. I've taken advantage of that. I've gotten full recovery. I've regenerated ATP. And that's another thing that a lot of people don't realize. Our training is anaerobic. So it utilizes anaerobic glycolysis. It grows through glycogen. So we're burning through glycogen, but recovery is an aerobic process. That's how our bodies work. So we need enough time in between sets to restore ATP and really regenerate our energy currency, essentially. And so, it's a 2-for-1 thing where taking enough rest intervals will allow you to have better performance. It might let you multitask as well. Or if you're someone that you don't want to be on your phone, you want to leave it. I have clients like that as well. That's where I use these antagonist paired sets, because I'm allocating enough rest to the body part itself, because in that interim, I'm still getting about 2 to 3 minutes rest in between sets, but it's because they're utilizing a different exercise for a different muscle group that isn't taxing the initial muscle group that we use on exercise 1. So say we have a 1A, a 1B pairing, and it is a incline dumbbell press to a unilateral lat pull down. And so when, they go from the incline dumbbell press, they finish their set, say it's 30 or 45 seconds, they walk over, they take about a minute rest, they go into their unilateral lat pull down, and they finish, think about it, it's unilateral. So now it's taking longer. So I've increased that work time and also that recovery. By the time they walk back over, get a drink, and go into their next incline dumbbell set, it's been 3 minutes. So they've fully recovered from a chest perspective, from a localized fatigue. They've dissipated that peripheral fatigue. And what we have to realize is, just like I spoke about acute and chronic fatigue, that's on a long-term spectrum, but we also have peripheral and central fatigue. And what happens, peripheral fatigue is at the local level. So we can kind of like, other people will refer to that as local fatigue, and that's within the muscle itself. And it takes a few minutes to dissipate that. But if we're to utilize very short rest sets, we actually see this in the literature. If you are to utilize very short rest intervals, you're increasing peripheral fatigue, and you can actually induce higher levels of central fatigue because of the accumulation and the lack of dissipation of that peripheral fatigue. So there's all these downstream effects that could come from underutilizing your rest intervals.
I love that explanation there. I don't think a lot of people are aware of it. And I also like how you said or shared how you use music to help stimulate the right nervous system. And there is so much research as well showing that we can actually help induce recovery so much quicker with not just breath work, for example, after training, but also with calm music and whatever. Like, and in the end, we're basically like a dog that can easily be trained to something, like that dog with the bell, where that starts salivating. Exactly. Or on the flip side, then also us, for example, with a high intensity music, and you suddenly get into the swing of your sets again. So really cool explanation. And with your programming, so what is your thought often when it comes to minimum amount of rest days, or do you program deloads specifically for your clients, or are you more someone who's like auto-regulating deloads?
Absolutely. So we'll work back, we'll do rest days, and then we can go into deloads. So rest days, we got it. I find there to be an essential part of training. They are part of my periodization program, and the intra-mesocycle or intra-microcycle, periodization that I'm utilizing. So rest days are the main recovery modality that I'm using within the microcycle or within the training week itself. And then deloads would be my main recovery strategy within the mesocycle, within the whole training cycle as a whole. So from a rest day perspective, this is a great way to manage fatigue and improve recovery throughout the course of the microcycle or the week of training. And what I really try to get across, because I know that this is always an issue with people, it's really hard for them to take rest days. And I understand that. I work with a ton of type A individuals that they really struggle with the concept of rest days, doing them good. But really, when it comes down to it, rest days provide us with both a physical and a mental reset throughout the course of the training week, so that we can go into the next week of training in a position where we can train hard again and adapt as we've recovered from our previous training sessions. So I always try to get across to clientele that, whether it be, so I'll give you my experience, because I work with such like a vast array of clientele that they're all over the board. So I never have I can never give you a set and forget protocol. I actually don't utilize the word protocol, because I believe in principles. I apply principles, and it's based on the individual that I'm working with. But I have certain individuals that are on a minimum effective dose protocol, or program essentially. And what that would be is 3 days per week. We're doing full body 3 days per week. So they're resting 4 days per week. And that's based on the current phase of their life that they're in. It's really based on their lifestyle. So right now, I have a couple clients that are utilizing just 3 day a week per week training, and it's because they're moving cross country, or they've just had a child, so they're really lacking sleep, or huge events within their life, stressful events that are really taking the emphasis, or they're taking the priority over training. But generally, the average client that I work with is going to train 4 to 5 times per week. So they're going to get 2 to 3 days, or 2 to 3 rest days per week. But then I also have some of these outlier clients that are professional athletes, that are IFBB pros, that really, in order to be able to effectively distribute the volume that we're utilizing, I need to use a higher training frequency. So I may have to use 6 days per week with certain of these individuals because of their training advancement, because of their goals, because of their recovery thresholds. And really, when it comes down to it, I kind of see training frequency, or the amount of times that we train a body part per week, or that we train per week in general, as a vehicle for distributing volume. And usually what I like to do is have clients at least train body parts twice per week, just to be able to sufficiently distribute their volume throughout the course of the week. However, with certain individuals, it's going to be 3 times per week. But generally, what I'm looking at is between 3 to 6 training days per week with clients. So we look at that, and that's between 4 to 1 day of rest days per week, based on that person's experience, their preferences. There are certain clients, they don't want to take more than 1 rest day per week. They start getting itchy, and they're going to go to the gym, and they're not going to adhere to the program in and of itself. So really, when it comes down to that, that's where I really have to meet in the middle between what's optimal for the goals that they're going for, and then what's also in alignment and what's practical for their lifestyle, for their preferences, for their mindset. And then when it comes to deloading, when we really look at the emphasis or the reason that we deload, it's essentially just a planned reduction in training aimed at lowering systemic fatigue. And so this can be done through a multitude of fashions. So I'll tell you how I do this, but this could be done through a variety. So we could look at it's essentially lowering total workload. So we can do that in terms of training volume, relative intensity, or essentially proximity to failure or frequency. So what I generally like to do, and it's going to range on the client. So I have certain clients I've been working with 3-4 years, and their deloads are very specific to them because I've learned that over time. But generally, I'm going to like to pull on all 3 levers, to be honest with you. So what I like to do is lower training volume a little bit, lower relative intensity. So if they were training 0 reps in reserve, we're going to go back to 3 to 4 reps in reserve. They might utilize the same loads, but now say they were utilizing 100 pound dumbbells on incline for a set of 10. That was their 0 reps in reserve. Now they're going to do 6. So now I've not only influenced their relative intensity or their proximity to failure, so they're not going as close to failure and not inducing as much fatigue as a result of staying further away from failure, but also I've lowered their volume because essentially I've lowered the reps per set. And then usually I will like to increase their amount of days off. So say a client is working out 6 days per week, I may just pull them back to 5 days per week within the status or within the context of a deload, because I'm really trying to help them dissipate both physical and mental fatigue, improve recovery, and then also improve their motivation, because that's another reason as to why, a lot of people, there's multiple reasons as to why someone would deload, but we generally see there's physical, physiological, psychological, and mental, rationale behind deloading. So really, this could be done for a multitude of reasons. And I personally do it in an auto-regulated fashion. So I never preset my mesocycles, to be honest with you. I've always taken a reactive, and I'll say this from context here, I do this now, but I learned through other mesocycle constructions years ago. So initially, I used to run specific paradigms. So, at one time, I was very highly influenced by certain individuals within our industry. I coached under them and things of that sort. So, maybe at one point in my career, it was a 4-to-1 paradigm, but then I realized that didn't fit everyone. Some people, they were trashed at week 3. And then some people, they literally felt like fresh as a daisy at week 4, despite training 0 reps in reserve. And then I was forcing them to deload just based off this, evidence-based structure that we had. And so now I take a completely reactive, deload type of scenario, which goes off based off their biofeedback. And there's certain parameters I'm looking for. So the first thing that I'm looking for to decide whether it's necessary or beneficial for a client to deload and whether I should implement one is when I start seeing performance regressing. And this can't just be a one-time thing. We have to realize that sometimes we're going to have a bad night of sleep. If I work with many parents, they're up all night with their kids, throwing up, whatever it may be, or just the child couldn't sleep. So the parents very well couldn't sleep. And so if you have one bad day, you have to realize that that's natural. We're not always going to have our best performances week on and week off, especially because towards the end of a mesocycle, just like I've talked about, fitness is increasing throughout the course of a mesocycle. So is fatigue. So sometimes that fatigue will mask your fitness, and you won't always have, it's not like every week, especially when you're advanced, is a PR week. So we have to realize that it needs to be consistent performance regressions, consistent performance drop-offs that we're seeing within, if you have multiple sessions for the same muscle group and you're starting to lose reps on your main, key indicate, like what I would call your key indicating lifts. So that really the lifts that we're focusing on progressing throughout the course of a mesocycle, that's an indication that you've really mounted a ton of fatigue. And then there's other indications from a physical perspective, that they're losing or that they're having an accumulation of systemic fatigue. So that could be when my clients are losing pumps, their sleep quality is becoming disrupted, they're losing motivation in the gym. So that's a good indication from a physiological perspective. Hey, this client could really, benefit from a deload, which would generally be a week-long period of lower training intensity, volume, and frequency. But also, a big thing within coaching, a lot of times when I hear people speak about deloads, they're only looking at the physiological perspective. So only the physical indications as to why someone needs a deload. What we have to realize is we cannot separate psychology from physiology. And all of us coaches know that because the body follows the brain. So if you're not in a good mental state, it is going to induce both mental fatigue, which is going to lead to systemic fatigue. And so within that, another reason why I would utilize a deload is if a client's going through a high stress period. This could include family emergencies, work deadlines, exam weeks, breakups, things like that. So, I'll give you an example. I just had a client that, I have a good relationship with, and she let me know that she just filed for divorce. So this is a really, key point in her life. This is a really emotionally, traumatic experience she's going through. And so I said, listen, let's go into a deload. Let's pull off. I just want to lower your systemic stress. And she's the type of person that she's a former competitor. So she's very driven, very type A, never wants to take time off. And the issue here is that she looks at this gym as an outlet, which is great. It's a phenomenal thing. But right now her stress load is so high that training, she's going to bury herself. And I know her personality, it's just not conducive. I need you to go into the gym. Like, I was on a consult call with her and I said, listen, I want you to go in the gym, just get a pump, get in, get out, break a small sweat, but I want nothing to failure. I don't want you like exercising your demons in the gym. Like, utilize that extra energy that you have that you're not utilizing in your training, and utilize it towards some meditative practices, towards counseling, towards other things. And that's a big thing why I like to decrease frequency within the context of a deload, because I want to encourage my clients, hey, listen, go in the sauna, go get, cryotherapy, whatever you want, like things that are going to relax you, time out in nature, go for walks out in nature, get that greenhouse effect where we see cortisol gets lowered from being out in green, areas. And so there's a lot of other things besides the gym that you could utilize throughout your deload week to really improve not only your recovery, but your quality of life. And then from there, also a couple other, mental considerations, I guess, for deloads, which would be if someone's feeling mentally or physically burnt out, if they're ill or they have an injury, or if they have a vacation or holiday. That's a big one that I leverage. So someone's, planning a vacation and, they were starting to show signs of fatigue a week or two earlier, and I'm going to push them through that. And I make sure that they deload during vacation, because one of the biggest things I see with clients is a lot of them, they get so anxious about going away during times and it being during like the last week of their mesocycle. Like, they want to hit top tier performances, but that's just not aligned with where they're at, the context of the vacation, what their family's going to be doing. So they don't want to be the person breaking up the holiday or the itinerary because they have to go train, 0 reps in reserve and bury themselves, and then they're exhausted the rest of the day. So there's a lot of considerations that we need to make in order to, ensure that we have great recovery capacity, but we're also aligning this with our lifestyle. That's really why I take that reactive approach.
Totally. I think that is a great reason why a pre-planned or generic deload approach is not the best approach, specifically for that reason. We don't know exactly that on week 8, every single person that we deal with wants to go on vacation, or we don't know that that's exactly going to be the week where they have a lot more mental stress. And that's why I also, when people ask how do you approach deloads, like how much should I lower my RPE or RAR or whatever it might be, and I think the method also here with it really varying from person to person is the best approach. Because for someone like your client there, the best advice really is, hey, just go and do a yoga, Pilates, whatever class instead, and maybe just stay completely out of the gym, as hard as it might sound. And for that mental reset too, because some people, not everyone loves training as much as we do. So, for them, every now and then it might be like, oh, I just really didn't feel like going to the gym. So, okay, that's cool. Do a spin class, whatever. It's, it's just something that you feel like doing. I think for me, the biggest criteria when I want to assess, is someone ready to get back into full training mode after a deload, is, are you like, you should be itching to get back into the gym. You should be like super excited to lift heavy again. It shouldn't be like, oh, okay, just another week. You should be like pumped. So
Absolutely.
I think that's a good and for that reason, sometimes I also extend deloads to 10 days, 14 days, whatever it might be. Really person dependent, but yeah, some really good points there. And you mentioned earlier that your family or your dad does strength training as well, potentially now to help with his diabetes. Did I get that correct?
No. So my PT, they were very into strength training. My father, honestly, he passed away a few years ago from the diabetes related complications, but honestly, his passing and all the things that I saw within him really has inspired me or really pushed me forward in my career, because when I first started coaching, he was very deep into his disease state. And so that's really what's caused me to have an interest, because I come from a bodybuilding background. So I competed 15 times back in the day. So I was very into it. And at that point in my career personally, as well as my own, I guess, physique pursuits, it was all about body composition. And
Right.
where I'm at in my career now is completely different. Yes, I'm trying to optimize body composition, but I'm trying to do it. This is one of my catchphrases within my coaching business, is a healthy body is a responsive body. And what I mean by that is when you optimize your health, your internal health, your mental health, in conjunction with things that help improve your body composition, your body's more responsive to the stimuli you provide it with. And so within that, I have much more of a health-centric coaching model than I did 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, it was all about aesthetics. Whereas now I'm more into ensuring that someone is insulin sensitive, their blood work looks immaculate, that we're improving multiple parameters. So I'm not only looking at their training performance and their body composition metrics, whether that be their scale weight or their visual photos, but I'm also looking at health markers like their blood glucose, their fasting blood glucose, their postprandial blood glucose, their blood pressure, their resting heart rate, and all these other autonomic nervous system metrics.
Oh, okay, awesome. Sorry, I got that wrong, but I would
No
love
worries.
for you to go a little bit into why strength training is so beneficial to improve insulin sensitivity, or just other recommendations to improve insulin sensitivity as well.
Absolutely. So, when we look at strength training, there's so many benefits that it provides us with, from, obviously the body composition, the energy expenditure, the metabolism benefits, but a lot of times we kind of overlook some of the metabolic health benefits that it provides us with. And really, when we look at resistance training exercise, it improves insulin sensitivity through a variety of mechanisms. So the first thing it does is it increases glucose, or muscle glucose uptake during muscular contractions, and that's via a pathway that's insulin independent, which is called GLUT4 translocation. It also, if we think about what we're doing when we're lifting weights, it's increasing blood flow, which is going to increase nutrient delivery, and it's going to improve nutrient partitioning. So more nutrients are going to be, essentially what happens when we resistance train is our muscles are more receptive and more sensitive to both amino acids and to glucose. So to both, protein and carbohydrates. And we see from resistance training in the literature that it increases skeletal muscle insulin sensitivity, after exercise for up to 48 hours. And so that happens even if someone's insulin resistant. So they've done randomized control trials with type 2 diabetics, as well as those that are pre-diabetic, meaning they have insulin resistance. And they've shown that it normalizes their blood glucose levels for up to 24 to 48 hours after those resistance training sessions. Now, mind you, if you are someone that's pre-diabetic, that means you generally have a blood sugar between 100 milligrams per deciliter and 126 milligrams per deciliter. This is like US metrics. But if you're diabetic, you're type 2, you're over that 126 milligrams per deciliter, which, really, when we look at the literature, what we want to be is between, say, 75 and 85. And we see that for every milligram per deciliter over 85 milligrams per deciliter, there is a likelihood of a 6% increased likelihood for type 2 diabetes in the next 10 years. So for instance, if you have a 95 milligram per deciliter in the States, or actually most blood work, the range is between 65 and 99. So if you had a 95 milligram per deciliter blood sugar on your lab work, for instance, on your CMP and your CBC, your doctor would say, oh, you're within the normal range. But realize that, what is the normal range based on? It's based off of population data. And who are the majority of people that are sampled, or who are the majority of people that go to get blood work? It's those that have illness and that are sick. And so within that, it's kind of skewed some of our lab ranges. So we want to shoot for what's optimal, but we see that if you had a 95 milligram per deciliter blood sugar on your blood work repetitively, that would lead you to a likelihood of a 60% increased risk for prediabetes in the next 10 years. And so that's why we really want to optimize these things. And one way to do so is resistance training, because we even see that exercise in of itself rivals other type 2 diabetic medications. So they've done lifestyle intervention studies where they've looked at diet and exercise combined versus the number one prescribed type 2 diabetic medication. So this was actually done with walks and with diet, but a very similar type of mechanism that comes from the increase in glucose uptake and insulin sensitivity. So they looked at 150 minutes per week of brisk walking and a diet intervention that lowered body weight by 7% versus a metformin group, which is the number one prescribed type 2 diabetic medication. They used a very large dose. And what they found was the lifestyle intervention, which was the brisk walking in conjunction with a improvement in diet quality and caloric restriction, led to twice the lowered the likelihood of diabetes by 2 times the amount that the metformin group did. And metformin is an incredibly efficacious medication. So we have to realize that exercise is medicine. And I always say resistance training, I kind of say this to my clients a lot of times when I'm trying to get past the fact that it's not just about aesthetics. Hypertrophy training is a vehicle for bettering your health. And that really does go downstream to insulin sensitivity, because within that, resistance training increases the oxidation of both glucose and fatty acids. So what that allows for is better metabolic flexibility, which is our ability to utilize different substrates at the right time. So during low intensity activities, we should be relying off fats. That is through, that we should be oxidizing fatty acids. But during anaerobic activities or higher intensity activities like resistance training, we should be burning through muscle glycogen. And so when we look at resistance training in and of itself, if I was to give you like the big pitch on why resistance training is essential for blood glucose regulation and for insulin sensitivity, it's because it increases both nutrient partitioning and insulin sensitivity through both insulin independent and insulin dependent actions. So the first thing it does is it upregulates GLUT4 translocation. And that's done both through training and physical activity. So when we've trained, we essentially have primed our muscles to uptake glucose and convert it into stored glycogen. Because what we've done during that training session is we've depleted glycogen stores. So now we've essentially, muscle's like a glucose sink. And so the more muscle we have, the more glucose we can utilize. And up to 80% of glucose disposal happens in muscle tissue. So when we resistance train, we're essentially burning through that. We're making our sink larger, and we're essentially utilizing exercise as the drain. So as our sink fills up with carbohydrates, we're able to exercise it off essentially and burn those substrates off. But when we look at how it works from a mechanistic perspective, GLUT4 transporters are usually insulin dependent, meaning that they translocate to the cell when insulin is present. So when our pancreas releases insulin after we've ingested carbohydrates, that's generally when GLUT4 comes in and it allows for glucose uptake into the cell. However, when we train, especially when we go through the active muscular contractions, it upregulates GLUT4 translocation independent of insulin. So we no longer need insulin to get glucose into the cell. So we can just pull glucose without that need for insulin into the cell, which allows our glucose or our insulin needs to be lessened. So now our pancreas doesn't have to secrete as much insulin. And so we're able to uptake glucose without as much insulin, which is why it's so effective for diabetics, but also it improves insulin action. So it has a two-pronged approach. So we're getting the benefits of insulin independent glucose uptake and insulin sensitivity benefits from that, but we're also getting better insulin action, meaning our insulin is actually working better at the muscle cell site. So resistance training is one of the most efficacious ways to improve blood glucose management and insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity. So there's so many multi-pronged benefits to resistance training in terms of not only our body composition, but our metabolic health. And I always try to like link those together, because we can kind of get like best bang for your buck by building muscle and moving that muscle, because muscle is essentially that storage site for glucose. But that movement, like I said, it acts as that drain. So it's allowing us to essentially enjoy more carbohydrates. One of the best benefits of building muscle, training, and being active is you get to eat more, and we all love to eat.
Thank you so much for that super detailed explanation, but also for making it so understandable with that sink metaphor. Super cool. I like that you also mentioned walks, though, because of course not everyone wants to dive right into resistance training, or sometimes we think, is it even worth going for a walk? And I myself, I love going for walks. I have been aiming for 10,000 steps or whatever a day for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's been honestly not just of course beneficial for my health, but also mental health. And I think that's not even a point that we have touched on so far in detail when it comes to strength training, but also just low intensity movement. But shifting gears a little bit, I'm curious if over the years, you mentioned you have been in this industry for a long amount of time, if over the years there have been many things or a few things that you have perhaps changed your mind on. You already alluded to some of the changes in terms of training, maybe because new research came out, or maybe simply because the research amounted to a point where you were like, okay, I need to change my mind now.
Absolutely. So I knew you were going to ask me this, and I really had to think back to, because I've been very fortunate, to be honest with you. I've been coaching a long time, and I've also surrounded myself with like-minded individuals. And if I didn't understand or know something, I have someone within my circle to reference to or to reach out to. So for instance, 2 of my greatest mentors, one of them is world-renowned within nutrition. So his name's Alan Aragon. I'm sure you're familiar with Alan Aragon Research Review. He's a close personal friend of mine, and he's been mentoring me since 2006. So I've been very fortunate that he was one of the initial individuals. So he never directly told me any answers, but what he did was he taught me how to think for myself. And what he meant by that, or what I mean by that, is he really taught me how to dig into studies. So whereas a lot of people, they'll see a study come out and they only look at the title and the abstract. he taught me, first and foremost, we're going to the methods section. We're seeing what they're putting their interventions in. We're looking at if there's ecological validity, meaning if it's externally valid, if what are the subjects? What did they do? What was the intervention? What did they utilize? Is it, an in vitro study, an in vivo study? Like, how does this apply to who you're working with, Brandon? He would always tell me that. And so he really taught me how to be a critical thinker. So for a long time in this industry, I've not went to others to learn. What I do is I'll break down the research and then see if it really applies to who I work with or to myself. And then I'll put it into practice before I really make a decision on something. I'm never one, I'll tell you, I'm a late adopter to a lot of things because I need a good amount of a mounting body of evidence to really change my mind on something. So I wanted to think back to, what did I think at the beginning of my coaching? So we're going to go 10 years back. We're going to go to Brandon in 2012 or 2013 when I first started coaching. And the biggest things that I probably changed my mind about, and it's really transitioned throughout the years. So I always say coaching is an evolution. We should constantly be not changing our thoughts, but we should be constantly open to realizing that research does not prove anything. It often just, sheds light on things we may have thought were correct and disproves it essentially. And so within that, a lot of the things that I thought were really around some of the mechanistic tie-ins. So initially, a good example of this is meal frequency. So when I started training, or even 10 years ago, I was under the impression this was something that was promoted by coaches, by bodybuilders, by everyone you could think of, that you had to eat 6 to 7 meals a day to not only optimize muscle growth, but also to maximize your metabolism. And that's really before, what's interesting is the first person that I saw actually do a study on this, and he's become a friend of mine now, is Dr. Bill Campbell. And so he did a study, I think in 2013, where he did he was part of a meta-analysis on meal frequency, and they looked at thermic effective feeding everywhere from like 2 to 3 meals a day, all the way to like 12 feedings a day. And there was no difference because it's about total calorie intake. And then also from muscle protein synthesis perspective, we really see in the literature that you can optimize muscle protein synthesis outcomes between 3 to 5 meals per day. And it's going to be, we actually have research that shows 3 meals is more effective than 6 meals per day. And this was in an overfeed or in a bulking study done on Japanese weightlifters. And so really when it comes down to it, it really has allowed me to shift my paradigm, because, if you had come to me 10 years ago as a client, everyone had to eat 6 meals a day. But now I have clients that eat 3 meals a day. Some eat 4, some eat 5, some eat 6, based on their preference, based on their lifestyle and what's convenient for them. And this is something that I've taken myself in my bodybuilding competitive days. I ate 6 meals a day. Now I'm so busy with business and other things. I prefer 4 meals a day, but I'm still maximally stimulating muscle protein synthesis every 3 to 4 hours while I'm awake. And I'm getting, a bolus around my training. So I'm making sure that within that peri-workout window, I have sufficient amino acid availability before and after to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Another huge thing that I changed my mind on, and this wasn't until maybe like 2015, 2016, we started actually seeing research on this, was the efficacy of high reps versus low reps. So I'm sure you remember at one point there was this repetition continuum. And what that means is we had the strength reps, which were 1 to 5, and we had the hypertrophy continuum. This was to maximize hypertrophy. It was 8 to 12 reps. And then anything 15 and above was proposed to only elicit muscular endurance adaptations. And so I remember being like avoiding 15 plus reps like the plague, because I didn't think that was going to build muscle when I was a bodybuilder at the time. And so now, when we really look at both the randomized controls trials and then the meta-analytic data, we have multiple studies that look at high load versus low load. So essentially high reps versus low reps, and they find equivalent outcomes as long as they're both taken to the same proximity to failure. So we actually see in most literature now that between sets of 6 to 30 reps, you can get equivalent hypertrophy outcomes. Now, there are some caveats to that. So we have to realize if you're utilizing all your sets in the 30 repetition range, it's going to be harder to get to that same point of fatigue. So we want to be within like 2 to 3 reps of failure, but there's so much peripheral fatigue and so much metabolite accumulation throughout those sets that a lot of people, they fall short. So they don't actually gauge, 2 to 3 reps in reserve or even 2 failure in that 30 rep set. So still to this day, I would recommend most sets between 8 and 15 reps, but it's nice to know that if you have an injury, like right now I'm dealing with some elbow issues. And so I'm utilizing blood flow restriction. I'm utilizing that typical, approach that we see in the literature, which is a buy-in set of 30 reps, which you're burning, and then it's 3 sets of 15 with 30 seconds in between. So I'm utilizing shorter rest intervals, but really what I'm trying to do is I'm including, my limbs, I'm including my arms, and I'm getting that metabolite accumulation, which is allowing me to get with lighter loads, it's allowing me to get more fiber type recruitment. So I'm still getting those high threshold motor units that would usually take much higher loads, much higher weights to get, but I'm getting them with lower loads. And so there's so many, what's great about hypertrophy training is it's a forgiving stimulus. So there's so many roads that lead to gains. And so this is something that I've changed my mind on. And another thing, I kind of mentioned this previously, but I used to be big into short rest intervals. And that was something I changed my mind on. Like 2015, 2016, Brad Schoenfeld came out with that three minutes versus 1 minute study. There's another meta-analysis by Gurgic that looked at this, I believe in 2020, that saw that when they looked at 2 minutes or more versus 1 minute or less, 2 minutes or more in all of the studies that they had to that time were superior for hypertrophy outcomes. So these are all different things within, my programming, within my approach to my own training that has transitioned and changed over the years. And I really think when it comes down to it, as a coach, I think we need to be willing to change our minds based off of a large amount of emerging evidence. And what I mean by that is don't just run with the latest study that you see posted on Instagram or you see, a Twitter post about. You have to really look at the larger body of evidence. Does this new study align with what we're really seeing within the literature? I'll give you another example of something I've changed my mind about, which has really been strongly reinforced within the last few years, is the topic of concurrent training. So concurrent training is the combination of utilizing both strength training or resistance training with aerobic training. Now, we used to believe in this interference effect. So if you look at any of the data before 2017, we always saw this interference effect, and it was all based on molecular mechanisms. So resistance training works off mTOR, endurance training amplifies AMP-K. And so these are, essentially competing molecular pathways. Well, now we see that in every meta-analysis that has been done since like 2019, we don't see concurrent training, so utilizing both resistance and aerobic training, to impair hypertrophy outcomes or strength outcomes. But what it does impair is peak power. So if you're a weightlifter, if you're a performance athlete, it could hinder some of your gains from those training, but it's not, as long as calories are sufficient, you're making sure that you're not doing, a huge, zone 2 cardio session immediately after your training session. As long as you're spacing those things out and you're not doing a ton of high intensity training that's going to obviously induce more fatigue and take away from, there's a recovery cost to say high intensity interval training, it's not going to hinder your hypertrophy outcomes. And what's really good about that is nowadays I train people in more of, I don't want to say a hybrid athlete type of modality, but I really like to incorporate both resistance training, aerobic training, and then steps as well. So we have physical activity, and that's more of a multimodal approach towards optimizing our outcomes. But if I go 10 years ago, I wasn't doing cardio with anyone because we all were so scared. Like we were the no cardio crew because we were scared that was going to hinder our gains, where now we actually see in some data that it actually could increase. We know that aerobic training increases mitochondrial density and capacity. It can actually enhance your gains, especially when you're a newer trainee. And if aerobic fitness is your limiter within your recovery capacity.
Really great 3 points. I like it. I like that you mentioned the energy factor as well with the last point, in the sense of there is no harm in adding cardio as long as energy is equated for, because I just recently read a research review. I don't remember what year it was from, but it basically stated that overtraining is incredibly rare. Most individuals that feel overtrained or that claim to be overtrained, etc., it's really a matter of underfueling. And you also touched on that earlier with REDS, with energy, just in not consuming enough energy across the board. So yeah, amazing topics. Thank you so much for all your knowledge and for sharing your philosophy with us. I know that there's going to be a lot of valuable takeaways for the listeners. I would love for you to plug your website or your Instagram so people can go and follow your amazing content.
Absolutely. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. Guys, if you have any interest in following me, getting any more information from me, my Instagram is Cruz _. My email is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. And as Lisa can allude to, I answer, I'm very quick with responding. So if you guys ever have questions, inquiries, or anything of that, feel free to reach out to me. And then also, I have a podcast myself. It's called the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. And you can find that anywhere you get podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, things of that sort. So I would love, and if you're a listener, Lisa, I would love for you to come and listen to mine as well.
Amazing. Yes, people go and follow Brandon, and so much valuable information. Thank you again for your time.
Absolutely.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, or share the episode on social. Very much appreciated. You can also follow us on Instagram at Nutrition Coaching and Life, or head to our website, www.nutritioncoachingandlife.com, where we provide more valuable content. Have a wonderful day. Now go out and work on your best self.